Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fourth edition of Let's Schmooze. I'm Doug Ebach, the original screenwriter for the movie Sweet Home Alabama. Each month, I'll bring on guests for a discussion on topics related to writing for various entertainment media. Today, my guests are Hollie Overton, a television writer whose credits include Shadowhunters, Tell Me a Story, and The Client List. Hollie is also the author of the novels Baby Doll, The Walls, and Runaway. She teaches television writing at Script Anatomy. And Jay Holtham, a playwright and television writer whose TV credits include Supergirl, Jessica Jones, Cloak and Dagger, and Pitch. Hello, guys.
Hello.
Welcome to the vlog. So we're going to be talking about writing spec pilots today. But before we delve into that, why don't I have each of you tell me the story of how you got started in television writing? Because of course that dovetails with writing a spec pilot. So, Jay, do you want to start first and give us
Sure. So I'm a New Yorker, native New Yorker, lived there my whole life, and I used to work in theater. I can still consider myself a semi-retired playwright. I retired in 2015, but have unretired in the last couple of years. So I did a lot of plays and a lot of sort of theater activities in New York. I worked in theater and did artistic producing. And long about 2012, I kind of hit my limit on New York and on theater. And so I sold everything I had and moved to LA, sort of sight unseen, on spec, as it were, without any TV scripts or film scripts, without having taken more than a 6-week class in TV writing or film writing, and just sort of dived in. I watched a lot of TV. And wound up writing a spec pilot that got me into the Humanitas, and then got me working on Pitch. And since Pitch, it's been sort of gig after gig off of that, originally that first spec.
All right, that's a good story. Hollie, how is your break-in story?
Well, I originally wanted to be an actor, and I grew up in Texas and moved to New York for college and went there and did a lot more bartending and waitressing than I did acting. And so then my mom was like, you should move to LA. And I was like, I hate LA, but okay. And so I was doing the acting thing out here. And then I ended up meeting a feature writer who I won a contest, and he agreed to mentor me for a year. And he was like, you should try to write for TV. Like, I was writing all these features even back then that were dramas that were hard to get made. But he's like, I really see your voice in TV. And so I wrote, so I took a class at UCLA Extension. And my first TV writing teacher was Bruce Miller, who created a little show called The Handmaid's Tale. And I wrote a spec for of an existing show for Friday Night Lights. And that got me into the Warner Brothers Writers Workshop. And from there, I staffed on all the shows, and I've just sort of steadily done that. But I did find in the workshop back then, when I got in, you didn't need an original pilot. You only needed a spec of an existing show. And so when I finished the program and I finished my first staff job, then I had to now I have to write a pilot. And the pilot that I wrote ended up getting me a new manager and ended up getting me my new staff job. So I really, the importance, they say it only takes one script, and it's really true.
Yeah. Right. Well, that actually is a good segue, because we are going to talk about spec pilots, but I know, television writers today are kind of advised, or aspiring television writers are advised to write a spec pilot as their way in. But I know that is a little bit controversial, and some TV writers advise doing the spec episode of an existing show. I just had a producer today tell me that he thought a feature spec was a better entree into television than even a television pilot. So I'm curious what you think about that. Either of you have an opinion.
Changes moment to moment, which changed already on this Zoom. Where I actually feel very strongly about it. I mean, I teach Script Anatomy. We teach, people take original classes to write originals, but we also still teach spec writing. And what I've found is that a lot of our writers who are now getting into fellowships or staffing have written a lot of specs, and their writing is it's just so much better. They understand structure more. They understand how it all works. because you can write a great pilot and it could take you a year to 2 years to write a pilot. But if you have to write a spec in a certain amount of time for these fellowships, it has to be fresh. It has to be current. It has to be an existing show. It can't be something old. So you're really having to like study a show and understand it. And so I say to writers, yes, you may not get a job off of that. And everybody's so impatient to want the job, but you're going to learn the craft. Because like, you know, we both like had written other things. Like if you're writing plays and stuff, then you understand story. So it might be easier. But if you haven't done any of that, like that's what you're going to learn by writing a spec.
Yeah, and like I go back and forth on it. I think you write a good script, and who cares whether it's a spec or not. I know people who've gotten work off specs, even in sort of this modern day when it's much more focused on pilots. The argument that I find persuasive about writing a spec is that writing a spec more closely approximates what your job is going to be, and learning to match someone else's structure, match someone else's voice. And be able to adjust your style for someone else is the job. And like, if you don't develop those tools and work on those tools, staffing is going to be really, really hard for you. So I definitely recommend at least trying it, at least, you know, giving a spec a shot, before you work on a pilot. And I know the sort of knock of that is, you know, people, like, in the environment, there's so many shows, people haven't watched it, they won't know what's going on. It's someone else's voice, someone else's vision. But, you know, I think about that guy who wrote ironically, the 9/11 Seinfeld episode. I think, you know, a spec, if you're really good, not really good, but if you work at it really hard, you can write an original sounding and original feeling spec. And if you do your job right, I think it's sort of like, if someone turned on a random episode of a TV show, maybe they won't know all of the details, but they should get a sense of what happened in that episode. And that's the important part, you know? If your spec really requires someone to have watched, you know, 7 years of a TV show to understand anything on the page, it's not a good spec. Like, you're not doing the job.
Yeah, although I agree with that for sure. But with everything being so much more, you know, open-ended and serialized now, it was easier to kind of write a spec episode when most shows were, you know, when everything was a procedural or a sitcom or something where everything stood alone. So I feel like, and I don't know, this is just my personal feeling, but, you know, the problem with writing a spec for a show that's on right now is you write something and then they immediately go a different direction in the storyline, and now you look like you don't know what's going on in the show. So do you think that's a problem?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's funny because I remember like when I wrote my Friday Night Lights, like it was like in between, like right before they like, you know, had an entirely new cast, and there was no way, you know, like, because basically between like seasons 3 and 4, everyone graduated and it was almost a new show besides like the coach and his wife. And I remember, you know, there was like a few core characters, and I remember being like, oh God, like when I watched it, but you know, like Jay said, it was a great spec. So like people didn't really care. And I think too, like specs are likely not going to get you the job, maybe like showrunners, not as many. Like I know there are still some, and it's a very heated discussion on Twitter often, but like if you're trying to break in, there's no reason why you shouldn't be entering these fellowships and shouldn't be like trying to get, you know, it should take you, if you're prepared to like staff, it should take you like, you know, a month to write a spec, you know, and I'm giving you a little window, because you definitely have to write a script faster than that when you're on staff. So what's a month of your life if it means you're going to get an interview for a fellowship or get into a fellowship that leads to your first staffing job?
Right. And I would say also, like, breaking in, for me, you've got to be strategic and you've got to be smart. You've got to be thoughtful as a writer. And, like, if you're doing a series that has a long time, I wouldn't write the episode that comes after this year's finale. Because, you don't know where it's going to go. You don't know what's going to do. Pick a point further back. Like, you can pick a point at any point in their history. Because, again, it's a sample. You know, it doesn't even have to really fit in continuity. And that's what I mean about allowing yourself, you could write a spec where you kill off all of the characters. You know, like, it's still the point is this going to be a fun thing for someone to read? And once they're done, are they going to say, I should talk to this person?
Yeah, it's a good point. You know, good writing is good writing, whether it fits in continuity of the show or not. So you can tell character, you can tell dialogue, all that sort of thing. So, Okay, so advice is to write a spec of an existing show first. Again, not the topic of the that I set out for this, but any advice to someone choosing to do that? Any advice about the way to do that?
I would say pick a show you're really passionate about and that you really know like inside and out, but also like pick a show that is something that you can also write, because it's different than being a fan of something and being like, oh, I love dark murder mysteries and I want to write a spec of The Outsiders, but that's not really what you do. Or like saying I'm going to write a procedural, but you don't really know procedure, like, and you want to do character. So like I think it's really important. Like I had a writer I worked with once who was going to write a Killing Eve spec, and he turned it in like, and I was like, oh, I don't know, like this doesn't really feel like your voice and who you are. And he ended up writing A Good Fight, and it was like such a great spec. And I would also say, when you're thinking about what to write, find something really specific that like you bring to it. Like when I wrote my Friday Night Lights, it was about a homecoming and Texas football. But in my high school at the time, or the middle school, there was all like, when I was growing up, there was always like bomb threats. And so like I took this like really personal thing that would happen and made it like the core focus of my spec. So the more personal you make it, because then when someone talks to you about your spec, you're not just talking about the show, but they're like, oh, this Ace story is really interesting. It's very specific. What made you think of it? And then you get to tell a personal story from your own life. Mm-hmm. And then they're like, oh, that person's really interesting. I want that person in my writer's room.
Yeah, I mean, that is always the goal, is to get them asking about you and get you talking about yourself. Same thing. All that advice, exactly. Like, a show that you know well, a show that you can write, a show that feels like it's within your wheelhouse, you know? I wouldn't recommend trying to spec, like, Legion right off the bat. Like, that's, I mean, maybe if you're that kind of writer, but just, you know, like, find a show that you really can get inside of and that you really know the rhythms of, to make sure that, like, your spec still feels... I mean, that's the great thing about specs. Like, when I say that I didn't know really anything about TV writing, I'm pretty serious. Like, I knew story structure, I knew character and motivation, but what I did was I watched a ton of Supernatural and Bones. And, like, watching that much Supernatural and Bones, you sort of, like, by osmosis, get a sense of how a TV show is structured. And I always recommend people watch those, especially because, like, you watch a show like Mad Men or Legion or something else, one of these, you know, really serialized, really sort of out there artistic things. I always feel like I don't know how Noah Hawley did that. I've got no idea how he came up with any of that. But you watch Supernatural and like, oh, okay, I can see what this does. I can replicate this. This is achievable for me. And it's a good stepping stone, because you still have to learn that stuff before you get to your pilot.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, like, that's a great example of, like, because there's rules, right? And, like, even if you were to really carefully, I mean, I'm sure if we did carefully break down Mad Men and Legion, there's some format to it. Like, there's, you know, but it's not as easy to understand. And, like, and for a writer who's just starting out, like, your craft level isn't where Noah Hawley or Matt Weiner is. So some of these other shows where the structure's a little more easy to understand, that's where you're going to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, you know, speaking about, like, the need to be able to write something fast, I have heard that concern, or I wouldn't call it a complaint exactly, but I've heard showrunners talking about the challenge of, like, you read this great sample, but, like, maybe they took 2 years to write it, you know, and, like, you're not going to have 2 years. So so maybe something that's a little more timely actually is a benefit to show that you were able to do it, you know, fairly quickly. But then, of course, it ages as time goes on and, you know, next time rolls around, but hopefully you're writing a new stuff anyway.
But to also be maximally fair, at least a third of the writing process when you're in a room is shared work, or at least in the rooms I've been. You're not like, although there are those rooms. I actually heard Supernatural is one of those rooms where it's like, this is your episode, here's your basic premise, go break the entire thing on your own, and then write the entire thing on your own. And I'm like, those kind of rooms terrify me, because I'm used to at least breaking story with other people. And, like, yeah, I've got a week to write it, but at that point there's an outline that exists, and it's easy to just be dialogue, and having, you know, worked on the structure as a group. Writing my own spec, having to do all of that all of that work on my own was a lot. Like, I was like, crap, this is really hard, you guys.
Well, that's actually one of the things I think about writing a pilot as a sample, or the expectation that you'd write a pilot is like, all right, so now you're expected to create a show that's a viable show, like not just be able to write a good episode, but create a whole show. Like that's a big thing for someone who's not working yet, so,
Yeah,
has no
exactly.
experience in a room or anything. Yeah. So that is interesting. So I'm curious, this actually may apply to both the spec episode or a pilot as a sample. There's so much different kinds of television now from, of course we had broadcast and cable and then streaming, or premium cable and streaming. And now even with like Quibi, there's all different kinds and forms. Any thoughts on like, what's the right kind of thing to do to show your work?
I think like if you really want to work in broadcast, then write a broadcast type spec, right? Like write the NCIS crime procedural that's really specific to you, or the half-hour sitcom that's like, like a mom, or, something like that. I think if you're like, I want to work in streaming, you've got to write that, like, I hate this word, but it's, it's like you've got to write that edgy, different sort of out there kind of sample that can still get you a broadcast job, but it doesn't work the other way around. It's really hard to write the like procedural, like very by the book, like, it can still be great, but something that like CBS or, NBC or something might want to buy, and then kind of get people to consider it as much for streaming jobs. It doesn't, it can happen, but I found that it's really kind of like that edgy, cool kind of sample can still go towards a broadcast job.
Yeah, same, very much the same. Like, write the show you want to be on, write the show you want to see in the world. Either a spec or a pilot. It's like, if you were, the president of TV, what show would you greenlight? And write that. And in some ways, your passion for it is going to come through on the page. Whoever is reading it is going to know this is a story you care about, you invested in. And that counts for a lot.
Yeah, I think that there's a similarity in features, for me and I know a lot of feature writers, we have that spec script that like everybody's like, I can't make that, but it gets you so much work, right? So
Yeah.
the thing everybody wishes they could make, and maybe there's a similar thing in television, right? Like something that's so like personal and out there, and everybody's like, that's cool, but they're afraid of it, kind of. But then they're happy to put you on something else and say, bring a little bit of that to what we're
Right.
doing.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a spec, and it was like, it's it's like a murder mystery, but it's very just the structure is very different, and it's gotten me more meetings than anything I've ever written. But like they're always like, what's the show? Because it's like it's kind of out there. So like as far as like getting, like it's sold once, and like and like it's still like the sample that I used probably the most, even though it's a few years old. But it is one of those things where like people just love the writing and the voice, and that's what you want. It may not be a show that gets greenlit, and obviously that would be ideal, but if people get excited about it and excited about you, that's the goal of the pilot.
Right. It's in a weird way, it is a sales tool, and it's a sales tool both for yourself and for the show. I go sort of back and forth on it. Like when I approach writing my first pilots, like I'm a genre person. I love sci-fi. I love fantasy. I take all of that stuff very, very seriously. But I really needed to learn structure and learn story and learn how to build a script. And so my first pilot was a cop show. I'd hit upon like a story that I read that was like, this is interesting. It's an interesting character. I can relate to this character, but let me write something that's more grounded in a more real world where I have to do less world building and less explaining, so I can just focus on the story and the characters and learn the craft before I'm going to approach trying to write a sci-fi fantasy thing that may be near or dear to my heart, but that like is just unwieldy,
Right. Okay. So now let's kind of like zero in on the actual topic. You're going to write your pilot. That's going to be your sample. And I guess like right now, let's assume that you're sort of a new writer trying to get that first job or get into one of the fellowships or something. So what do you think is most important that you get across in that pilot? Like what's sort of your goal for that pilot?
I feel like the question I get most now when I'm like, either pitching or thinking about what I want to write is, why are you writing this? And I feel like because of like the world and that we're living in now, social justice is obviously so much more important. We're dealing with a pandemic, a health crisis, a climate crisis. Like, buyers and like people who are reading your work, like they want to know that you have something to say, right? So yes, you want to entertain them, and not every story has to deal with, but there has to be something. And I think if you can also, again, go like deeply personal, so that when they read that and then they like meet with you, then they're like, wow, like not only did this person like tell an entertaining story, but they had a message, they had a strong theme, but it was relevant to them and also felt relevant to me in some way. Because the goal is that you try to connect. So I think that's something like, it's not now enough, I think, because there's so many great writers out there. Like there's so many more people writing. People are all over the world now being able to like, so I think it's like, say, like not just being like, this is a great idea, but what's the like next layer beneath that great idea? And why is that going to get someone excited about it?
Exactly. And then, like, to sort of jump on that, like, there's this elusive thing that is voice, that is, and point of view and personal philosophy is part of it, and part of it is just the feel of the words on the page. Like, really think about it and really spend your time. Every single word on that page is part of telling your story, part of conveying tone and world and all of that. And it's like you've got to think about that, and you've got to think about, like, why am I telling this story? What part of the story is important to me? And what am I trying to communicate to whoever is reading this? And how do I communicate that as clearly and effectively, and in some ways as quickly as possible? You want, in the first couple pages, you want to tell them, this is the world you're in, this is what's going on, these are, to some degree, the stakes and the characters, let's go, and trying to, in order to do that, you've got to really, really refine that in yourself, and really refine your sense of the story down to a point so that you can do the fine work.
Yeah. So, and you and I met, if I remember correctly, on a panel at the Hollywood Festival called the First 5 Pages.
Yep.
I believe was what it was, and it was kind of about like the heavy lifting that those first 5 pages do. So, I think like one of the things we talked about is you don't want to overload those opening pages with a bunch of exposition or setup for your imaginary series that will probably never get made, right? Like we got to show character, we got to show story right off the bat, because that's what they're looking for when they're looking to staff you. And really, if they're looking to consider it as a series too, probably they want to know that stuff's in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I found sometimes a lot of times in the first 5 pages, like people will introduce like a lot of characters too. Like it's like, oh, it's an ensemble drama, and there's like 7 characters within like the first 2 pages, and you're like, oh my God, I'm never gonna know all these people. Like slow it down, like get it, like we need an entry point, right? Like who's this person that you're following? Who's the person that you're gonna care about, even if it is an ensemble. Because Sex and the City was an ensemble, but you still had Carrie Bradshaw as your center.
Yeah, and if you're going to do that, you've got to be, like, look at the best examples. Look at The West Wing. And, like, The West Wing 1 does start with, like, a 2-person scene that lets you know, okay, this is Sam Seaborn, this is what's going on. And then you find a trigger to introduce those other characters in circumstances where we can understand what's going on. I'm still also, though, in pursuit of my white whale, which is a challenge Glenn Mazzara had thrown down in a workshop I was in with him, where he wanted to read a spec where there was no dialogue in the teaser. And I'm like, and still you can convey story and action and all of that. And I'm like, that's glorious,
That might fall into that category of like, kind of making that bold choice, which kind of cuts against what the expectation is to really stand out.
Yeah.
And the big swings, of course, you miss a lot of the big swings too, but then when you hit, that it can really work.
Yeah. I mean, not exactly a rule of thumb, but a sort of goal for me in thinking specifically about specs, and specifically about them as samples. This is sample work. It's not necessarily the Mad Men script that you're going to carry around for 10 years, or this, cri de coeur script of yours. It's like, this is my sample, and like, for me, it's a strong first 5 pages, but the first 5 pages should be so strong and so clear that if the person literally flips to the last 3 pages, they still understand the story that happened in between. And, like, that's, again, the holy grail is, like, then you've done it. Then, like, one, you save them a lot of time. They don't have to actually read the whole thing. But also, like, your story is so clear that the setup, no matter what has happened in between, still makes sense. It's not like they're reading that last page and they're completely confused or it feels like it's some other world.
Yeah, I heard a showrunner one time talk about how, to the point of how important those first few pages are, is that they said they rarely had time to read more than 10 pages, even when they liked it, because they really just they had so much reading to do and so much other work to run a show, of course, that, they really just had to make a decision based on the opening. So, it's interesting, the idea of, like, flipping to the last 3 pages, because I also had the experience long ago when I was an intern reading scripts at Zoetrope of reading a script that the first 10 pages were amazing. It was a feature script. The first 10 pages were amazing, and then it was clear everything after that was first draft, right? And someone had told this writer, like, the first 10 pages is everything, and so that's where they put all their energy. I'm like, it's great, but you do actually have to deliver the rest of the script.
Exactly. You really do.
So you better be prepared for them to flip back to those last. Good. Any other sort of, like, craft or goal tips for writing that pilot as a sample?
I think a lot of writers, like, think that, like, okay, like, they just hear about these, like, like the Mickey Fishers who sell the pilot to, like, and becomes a series on, CBS, and those are great stories, and I think, like, we all need that hope, but, like, kind of just going in and knowing that, like, you're like Jay said, your pilot is a sample, and it's great if you can sell it, but I've done lots of talks, and I went to class once, and they were like, every writer was like, I just want to be a showrunner. I don't want to work on anybody else's show. And I was like, it was like a whole panel of established writers. And a lot of us didn't have our own shows yet. And it's like, what do you guys think we're trying to do? Like, we've put in the work and the time. And so I think, like, kind of just understanding that, like, your first pilot, like, I think my first pilot is pretty terrible when I go back and read it, but I think it did have a strong voice and it did have a strong hook. I think that's the other thing, like, have a strong hook, have a log line that's going to, like, make you stand out. But I think just, like, being realistic and knowing that, like, if your first pilot gets you staffed, you are doing so well. Like, you are doing amazingly well and should be really proud of that. But the, like, only sell it or get a show made or bust, that's a really, like, naive way to go in and think about it. And it can happen, it's great, but I think it's not super realistic.
Yeah. And I would say in terms of craft, like, 1 second, everything Hollie just said, listen to her, she's super smart. And I would say in terms of craft, what I also run into a lot with earlier writers or newer writers is they've got some great idea for a show that's got a huge twist that's going to come, like, 3 seasons in. And I'm always like, put it in the pilot. Just put it in the pilot. Like, it's your one shot. Don't hold back. Don't save anything. Like, get it on the page. Start your story as close to that twist as possible. Because, yeah, we're not really going to be here for a 3-year slow burn, It
is an interesting...
that is such good advice, Jay. Oh my God, that's, like, my favorite advice. It's so true, because people will be like, no, that comes in the season finale. And I'm like, who's watching your season finale? Like, it has to go early.
I've also heard people talk about, like, well, I don't want to burn through story too fast, and I'm like, it's a pilot. Like, you've got to get to the story, right? Like, look at the Breaking Bad pilot. How much happens in that 45 minutes? That's amazing. And
but I think, Doug, like, peak TV is.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think peak TV is sort of, like, hurt that, because, like, you'll watch a show like Mindhunters, and obviously that's, like, but it's a slow paced show and it's David Fincher, and so we get that because we know he's building. But if I'm reading a newer writer and it takes 17 pages for me to know what the plot is, like, I'm putting that script down. Like, it doesn't matter how good the writing is. And so I think that's something really important, that, like, writers like pace and getting to, like, the big moments in a script are so important.
Yeah.
I want to actually, Hollie, jump back for a second to something you were talking about in terms of that series or bust, the auteur kind of theory of television, I guess you would call it. And that's an interesting thing because I hear that a lot. And also I've been on panels where, people during the Q&A will kind of bristle at the advice you have to be like a person people can get along with, like that you have to be someone that can be pleasant in the room. And they're like, but if I'm a great writer, why should I have to be a good person? And which I'm like, why are you making that argument? That's like, first of all, like you're fighting to not be nice. I don't understand. But it's an interesting thing because I kind of feel like, do those people really want to work in television if that's their idea? If the only thing they can do is create their own original thing, television maybe isn't the place for them. I don't know. I guess you can't really give that advice. Don't go into television, but that just seems to be an observation I have. Is like, do you understand what this business is like? If your only thing is you have to control everything, you're not going to be happy here.
The irony of what I was saying before is that Noah Hawley worked on Bones. He was staffed on Bones for like 3 years, and then created Fargo and Legion. And it's like, I don't know. It's also the old story about the creation of the Shield and Sean Ryan working on Nash Bridges with Carlton Cruz and Glenn Mazzar and all these guys. And they had, the story is there was a list of things that Nash Bridges could not do, like rough up a suspect, plant evidence, curse, all these things that was not going to happen on Nash Bridges. And then Sean Ryan sat down to write a pilot where a cop broke every single one of the rules in the pilot, and that became the Shield, and off to the races. Like, staffing is really important for learning how to be a writer, and being at least a person that people can stand being around for 8 to 10 hours is key to staffing. And I still get mad a little bit about, the sort of culture, and I don't blame the writers, obviously, because they're writers, but it's the culture that I attribute a little bit to the sort of the agency mindset and the we're looking to sell things mindset of, you've got to sell a show out off the bat to make a splash. And it just, really has robbed people of writing more specs, watching more TV, of wanting to be a staff writer.
Yeah, I think I was like, I have a friend who was like, and I've had friends who have managers who are like, oh, I don't want to staff you. I'm only going to try to develop and sell. And like, 'cause staffing's too hard. And I'm like, I don't know how staffing's any harder, on the, for anyone than it is to sell a show and then get that show made. And I, at the end of the day, I think that's a money issue, because for representation, it's like, you're going to make a lot more money if you sell a writer's show than if you just get, a staff writer is not going to pay an agent's bills or manager's bills. But I think for there is a little bit of with the Netflix, Hulu, with all of that, of writers feeling like, oh, well, I'm too good to do X, right? Like, oh, I only want to do, and I think it's so hard to even get whatever job you're getting in TV, and sort of just having that gratitude, but also it is a training ground. And a lot of times now, with the way that the business has shifted, there's so many mini rooms, and you're on a show that you might break the show this year, and that show's not airing until 2022, and you're not even going to be on set for that show. And so I think for writers who think I'm just going to sell a show and then it'll you're missing out, because those jobs are harder and harder to come by, because the rooms are smaller, the orders are shorter. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you have a great pilot and someone wants to staff you, I would jump on that,
Yeah.
Well, and Jay, to your point, I think the learning part is key, because, I think there's this idea that these guys that create these great shows, the Matt Weiners of the world, are they were always that guy just waiting for the opportunity. And it's no, they learned how to do that by being on these other shows, right? Or Sean Ryan, you're saying, it's maybe he wouldn't have written The Shield if he hadn't had that Nash Bridges experience. So you're not really robbing yourself. But I also agree, Holly, that, I think this could be, this probably will end up being a whole other podcast here, is your agents don't always have your best interests, surprisingly, at heart, right? So
stop it. That's not true.
And sometimes they may even think they do, but they're driven by a certain money formula. It's a little bit of a lottery system, and really, it doesn't really work that way most of the time for a successful writer. So sometimes you have to kind of be wary of agent advice.
Mm-hmm.
So What about, is there any difference between writing a pilot to get staff versus writing one to try to sell, if that was your goal?
I think a little bit. Like, I mean, the spec that I wrote that like got attention, like I kind of knew that because the device that I was using to tell and the way that I was telling the story, like it's a show about a murder, but we know who's the killer by the end, right? So I wasn't trying to write a whodunit. Like I was trying to write a psychological thriller, right? And how this person's going to be captured and how this murder affects all the characters. But I think, and I've had meetings about it that I was like, if I was trying to just sell this, I would have like saved some stuff, or like had a few more, like the cliffhanger, like I would have approached it differently. So I do think that there's, like, it's the thing to get attention is like, this is a sample, or it's the thing that like, this is what I know these buyers like, or if I'm trying to like approach something like they like a specific structure, or like CBS isn't going to buy a show that's like an avant-garde procedural, like, cause I think they tried to make, LA Confidential, and like, like they were just never gonna probably like, and I know the writer who did that, they were never gonna like make that show the way that, you know what I mean? So I do think there is something about being a little bit inside the box if you are just trying to sell something, which is, or you're just trying to get attention and get that first job, or just staff.
Yeah, I would definitely concur with that like, sort of a little bit contra what I just said, like you do want to think about, okay, this is going to be, I'm trying to sell a series. Like really, again, it's still a sales document, but in this you're trying not just to sell yourself, but you're trying to sell a whole series. And so what you want the sample to be, you want the sample to one, end in a way that they're like, I need to know what happens next. And two, you wanted to give a sense of like, what's the engine of this series? What am I going to be watching? And you've got to think about it. That's another reason why I almost feel like you shouldn't try to sell. And, the guild doesn't keep you from doing it, but there are sort of structures that kind of slow down the process of selling until you've been in a room, until you've staffed, until you've worked on a show, because it's hard to really know what building the engine of a show is like until you've had to break, 10, 20 episodes of a TV show. And there's a lot of sort of learning that happens there. And so, coming to a pilot that like, okay, I'm going to try to sell this, it is very much thinking about like, what is someone going to be watching every week? Who are they going to be watching? And even to a certain degree, what sets are they going to be using? What locations are they going to be using? Thinking about the market, like, where do I want to sell this and how much money is it going to cost to make this thing? And those are sort of slightly higher level kinds of thoughts to have.
Yeah, and it kind of dovetails too with that idea of like wanting to sell a series or nothing. Because a lot of times then people come to me and say like, well, everybody's telling me if I want to sell my series, I have to attach an experienced showrunner. So how do I find that person? But like to Hollie's point earlier, it's like those people are all trying to sell their own series. Like they don't want to help you, right? They spent their time earning their right to be a showrunner. So, I mean, obviously it happens sometimes where someone buys something from a newer writer, and then there's money involved, and it's a go show, and then a showrunner might get interested. But yeah, if you're just out there speccing, and the idea of you're going to attach an experienced showrunner is probably not realistic, I think.
But we've heard we've heard and seen the stories about like the newbie who comes in and gets a show and it's super exciting. And then like a few months later, they're fired because they couldn't play nice. They didn't know the rules. They felt threatened. And there's those stories about the person that hires them takes over the show. Like, you never know. I mean, it's a marriage, right? And like, I think like Suits is a great example. Like the guy was a first time creator and they brought someone in to supervise him, and he did it for a couple seasons. And then he was like, you know how to do this. Here's your show. Yeah. And I mean, that's the best case scenario. But I think like it is like Jay said, you've got to, and like you were talking about, like, you've got to have the personality. If you're the person, because I've been on shows where showrunners have gotten fired. Like everybody thinks they're irreplaceable, and it's just not true. Like anyone can get fired, even if you are the person with the brilliant idea of the show that they bought. Because at the end of the day, once they have the show, they're like, well, it might not be as good, but we'll have a lot less headaches. And that's what they want. They want a great show with no headaches. So I think it's like really important to say, like, you can be a good writer, but if you're a jerk, like, not to say jerks don't do well in this town, because we all know that's true, but it's a lot harder to get those breaks, you know, if you earn that reputation, especially when you're starting out.
Yeah.
Or famously Aaron Sorkin getting fired off West Wing, not for being a jerk, but because like he couldn't write at that TV pace, right? And he didn't really know how to delegate because that wasn't his style. So.
Yep, exactly. I mean, there's, you know, one of the things that my friend Steve Harper told me when I was just starting was you're essentially running a multi-million-dollar small business for someone else. Mm-hmm. And if you can't find somewhere in you to be a good manager, being a showrunner is not for you. It's a very high stress, very difficult job that is mostly not writing. And it's sometimes weird, and we'll see as, you know, sort of developing, and I think the winds in the industry are certainly sort of changing, not necessarily for the better in some ways, but we'll see whether or not it continues to be writers as sole showrunners, because it's a lot of power to hand people who are not always equipped to deal with it.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that from writers that are like, you get put in charge of this thing that your experience has not trained you. I mean, it has trained you a little bit, but it's like you're being asked to do things that was never what you learned to get into the business and to become a successful TV writer, you know, with budgeting and casting and things like that, that it's like, that's, you know, suddenly you're now responsible for all this stuff.
HR.
Yeah. Well, that actually brings me to another question, which, you know, so with the caveat, first of all, that I know neither of you have a crystal ball of what the future holds, but the television business was changing a lot before COVID-19, before the coronavirus happened, and now that's kind of blown everything up and created, who knows if it's temporary or permanent changes in some cases. Do you have any thoughts on where television is heading, and if there's anything a aspiring writer or even, you know, a working writer should be thinking about right now?
Wow. I mean, I have no clue where it's going. Like, I think, like, you know, I think there's going to be like more levity, and they're going to, like, maybe not as many of the like dark, serious dramas, but who knows? Like, I know that then I read the trades and they're buying that too. But I would say just like now is the time to, like, it's easy to get discouraged, and like there are a lot of people leaving LA and a lot of people who are saying like, now you don't even have to live here anymore to be in the business, which I think is the advice I've heard people giving. And then I'm like, but it's all going to come back here. So I think that's a little like wishful thinking on people's parts who don't want to stay in LA because it's an expensive city. And, but I think just to like write the passion projects, like Jay said, like write that thing that like now is the time to do that, especially if you're like trying to break in, like write the thing that scares you, write the thing that you're excited about. Because I do think there is still a market. And also I think like there's a great push for diversity, which like, I hope it's not a fad. I hope it continues. I think like everybody is really looking for that. And I'm hoping that that's something that's going to continue, but it is something people are hungry for right now. So I think anybody who's writing should be thinking about that too.
Yeah, definitely think about diversity. Definitely think about your personal philosophy and writing the thing you care about, always. And the other thing is trying not to think about the business, try not to think in some ways about the pandemic and how it's going to change. Like, we don't know. You know, right now, everything is up in the air. It may all settle back into the same place it was. You know, it may be something completely different. You know, depending, everything for the rest of this year is so up in the air. And we won't really know how any of it's going to shake out until, like, midway through next year. That it's hard to plan, so don't. Just, like, write a script you give a shit about and do what you can to get it out into the world. And that's always going to be the best thing you can do.
That's good, inspiring advice there. Good to kind of like start to head to wrap this up. Any final thoughts on someone writing there?
I would also say, and this is more not to Jay's point about getting your work out there, is like, and this is also controversial. So I'll I don't even like go there on Twitter because I'm afraid, but I still think that the reason of my career, like big breaks I've gotten, are because I entered contests and it got my work in front of people that mattered, and people who, you know, even if it wasn't like winning big money or winning, it was like meeting people who knew people or who were going to give me advice that I wasn't going to get from my peers because they weren't, you know, professional writers. So I think like doing your research, because there are a lot of scams, but doing your research on contests and then putting your work out there. Because if you're just sitting in your house and you're writing script after script, you're not going to know if it's good. But I have just seen, not just myself, but so many writers I'm friends with over the years who've gotten breaks, that once you start getting, honorable mention or second round or, whatever, like your work is hitting, and it tells you like, okay, the script is almost there, but not quite. And so I think that's just really important, as opposed to just waiting for the agent or manager to like come knocking, because it's really hard to get repped. But everybody wants to rep that person who's already been validated in some way. And so those contests are really good ways to get that pilot or spec script you're writing, to get that some validation, to then say to the agent or manager you met, like, hey, my script just won Austin Film Festival or whatever it is.
Yeah. I would, one, double down on all of that, and two, I would, just go back to you write. Just write as much as you can, and in some ways, most importantly, finish. Finish the script. Get to the end, even if it's not the perfect end, even if it's not right, but finish it, because you're not going to get a job for half a script. You're not going to win a contest with half a script. Like, actually finishing the work is so key, and pushing yourself to finish it. And make sure, even if you only finish one thing a year, you don't have to. Sometimes people get caught up in volume and trying to write so many different things, and I'm like, just finish the script. And once it's done, then you can think about the next thing, or you can think about revisions or whatever else needs to happen, but make sure you finish it.
Yeah, and I do think there's not to say volume is everything, but I feel like you get better by doing different things, and sometimes you maybe go back to a script and once you've written a couple of others and realize how to fix it, but you don't get there unless you kind of move on and try the next thing, right? So good. So any other final thoughts?
I was gonna say, if you spent more than a year on a script, like, it's time to move on, right? Like you said, like if you're still like, but I wrote this, if you're telling your friends about this script that you wrote a year ago and you're still like excited about it, but nobody else is, like, it's like, put that away and be proud of what you did, but move on. Because I know I wrote a script once and I was like, this is it. This is the script that changes my whole career. And it was like literally like, nope. Like, it was like, it got nothing, like no attention. I don't even think it got me a meeting. Like, it was just like, it just wasn't the script. So like, don't hold on to that one project. You can put it aside and, maybe it'll come back later, but you're going to get better with each script. So don't be precious with that one you wrote.
Yeah. To double down on that, it is, as they say, a marathon, not a sprint. You're building a career. So take your time, write your things, keep working, and just keep moving forward. Always just keep pushing forward till you get to the end. Because otherwise, don't rest on your laurels. Don't sort of invest in this one thing as the thing that's going to make my whole career. If that's your one idea, you're not going to have a career anyway. So you're going to have more than one idea, more than one script, more than one iron in a fire somewhere.
Yeah, that's all great advice. So thank you guys so much. This was great, and I think will be very helpful to everybody. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope to see you next time for more discussions of film and television writing.